The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
Tensions over trade, anger over China's illicit exports of fentanyl, a downed spy balloon, deported pandas, all amid global concerns about wars in Ukraine and Gaza. While relations between the U.S. and China are cold. But President Biden is about to hold a press conference at that podium you see right there. Today, he met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. It was their first time meeting in a year. Good evening and welcome to this special report from the newsroom of The Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Well, President Xi's visit to the U.S. is his first in 6 years, and it's happening as part of the economic summit, APEC, which is taking place in San Francisco this week. Let's talk more about the importance of this meeting with senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin, columnist James Hohmann, and in Woodside, California, White House reporter Yasmeen Abutaleb. Yasmeen, thank you so much for joining us. Grateful to talk to you as we prepare to hear from President Biden. How much do we know about the meeting today between these two world leaders?
Well, we don't know too much yet because we haven't gotten a readout of the meeting yet. We're expecting that to come from the president himself. When he begins his press conference, he'll give a sort of readout of how the meeting went, any agreements they might have come to before he starts taking questions. And so we don't know too much yet. We just saw them a couple times throughout the day. They both made some comments before they sat down for the expanded bilateral meeting with members of their cabinet delegation, where they both sort of said, you know, the U.S. and China haven't always had a smooth relationship, but it's more paramount than ever that they find a way to work together for both countries' sakes. And we saw them that they took a walk around this estate that they're meeting in a little bit outside of San Francisco. And President Biden gave 2 thumbs up and said the meeting was going well, but we haven't gotten any sort of detailed read of what the discussion was, any points of contention, and any agreements that might have come as a result.
Yasmeen, as we hear you talk to us by phone, we're looking at images of them meeting earlier when President Xi first got out of the car and they went in to talk. How much is riding on this meeting?
There's a lot riding on this. I mean, on the one hand, no one from either the U.S. or the Chinese side expects, you know, really significant agreements or policies to come as a result from this. Really, the point of this meeting is for the two leaders to meet face to face to make sure that they still have a line of communication so that there isn't some miscommunication that leads to an escalation in the relationship. So in that sense, the stakes are high because both these countries want to make sure that they can talk to each other, that they can communicate, because the biggest fear for President Biden is that some misstep or miscommunication between the U.S. and China, if they're not talking, leads to a major escalation that neither side actually wants. But in terms of substantive agreements or policies, I don't think we're expecting to see anything on that side.
And finally, before we let you go, so much of this visit was very choreographed, anticipating exactly what President Xi would be seeing. Tell us about the coordination of this.
Yeah, U.S. officials said all these meetings are carefully choreographed, but they had to take extraordinary measures for this one. You know, President Xi does not leave China that often, and they needed assurances that he wouldn't see certain things outside his window, like massive protests or demonstrations. That's just not something he's accustomed to, given the Communist Party's control in China, and that there would just be a lot of respect shown to him while he was here. So, you know, on the way here from San Francisco, we did see some small protests on the side of the road, nothing major, you know, but they even had to do things like figure out how many steps he was going to have to take in a room before he reached his seat or before they went to have a handshake. So there's been a lot of careful planning in ensuring that this can happen.
Yasmeen Abutaleb with the Washington Post, who is there in Woodside, California. Thank you so much. I want to bring Rhonda and James into the conversation. James, how much and why does the White House put all of this effort into the optics here? How much does the White House need this to go well?
They really need to reopen the lines of communication. President Biden came in, just like Barack Obama before him, saying there was going to be this pivot to Asia, to the Indo-China region, and he has been, in a word, distracted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the events in the war in Gaza. And so now, while the U.S. has been laying a lot of the groundwork with things like the Quad and new alliances to form a bulwark against China, there has now been this trade war that's been going on really since 2018, and it is economically damaging, especially to China, but also the United States. And so both sides have an interest in sort of stabilizing the relationship to what the mantra that the president has used before is competition, not conflict.
You know, Rhonda, you cover Congress on such an intimate level, and it was the visit of Nancy Pelosi that did change the dynamic most recently of our national relationship with President Xi. So remind us, refresh our memories of that trip, why she went and what happened.
Well, Nancy Pelosi, when she was Speaker, it was in August of 2022, she wanted to visit Taiwan. It was something that the White House said not to do, that they didn't support her doing that type of visit. They said the military wasn't informing them that it was the right choice, but that they also wouldn't stop her. She went ahead. She also was accompanied by 5 Democratic congresspersons, and they went to visit Taiwan. China didn't take that too well. They saw it as an affront. They immediately stopped and ceased military-to-military communications between our military and theirs. And that's part of, on the agenda of President Biden today, is to try to restore that, or at least take some steps to getting some guarantees from Xi on that issue. But you see how, outside of the White House, the actions and the steps of our politicians do affect geopolitics. And that is something that when the Pelosi visit happened, everyone was well aware that it could be deemed controversial for Beijing, and that has been a part of the tensions. Also part of the tensions was the instance of the surveillance balloon that flew across the country, particularly in the middle part of the country, and was shot down. That's something that China said it was just a commercial balloon that went off track. But the U.S. shot it down, and that also increased some of the tension. So these are all the things going into today's meeting that Biden likely prepared for to discuss, try to ease those tensions. And yeah, there's a footage of that moment. And so many people were afraid of that. I remember being on the Hill talking to members of Congress about that moment with that balloon. You know, they didn't know what to do because it was somewhat unprecedented, but it was a big concern because no one knew exactly what it was. But again, it shows you that there are steps that both countries are taking right now to sort of ease tensions at a really critical time.
Remind us why Pelosi went to Taiwan in the first place. Why was this so important to her?
It's also, you know, Taiwan, the U.S., since Richard Nixon went to China 50 years ago to open ties and to balance China against the Soviet Union, the U.S. has maintained an official one China policy. Originally, during the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong, or I'm sorry, before that, they ran Chiang Kai-shek off to Taiwan. It was sort of the official government of China that the U.S. recognized was in Taiwan. China sees Taiwan as part of China. So the U.S. basically agreed, we want eventual reunification. And that continues to be the official posture of the United States. But increasingly, China has built up a larger and larger military presence to potentially swallow up Taiwan. And the U.S. has spent more money over the years, sent Marines to train Taiwanese military forces to prepare for a potential attack by China. So Pelosi going was about showing support for basically Taiwanese independence or sovereignty, and that is something that the president himself has sort of gone up to the line on to say the U.S. would support Taiwan if it was attacked by China. And Xi, U.S. intelligence officials have said, sees retaking Taiwan, bringing it into the fold of China as central to his legacy. And so that, you know, U.S. support is especially important against that backdrop. This is something that is very, very, very delicate, and I'm certain the president's going to be asked about Taiwan, and I'm also certain that he has prepped and practiced his answer to avoid really causing a stir in U.S.-China relations during this moment when there is this desire for détente and to make them a little warmer than they have been for the last year.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring Olivier Knox into the conversation, national political correspondent, anchor of the Daily 202. Olivier, one of your headlines this week in the Daily 2 was this: both President Biden and candidate Biden meet Xi. Let's talk about those distinctions. I really loved the way you looked at this, because there are two Bidens essentially holding this meeting today.
Sure, and it's hard to distinguish between a sitting president and a president running for re-election. Obviously, we see them as dual-hatted all the time, but I looked at that because there were a couple things that occurred to me as I looked ahead to this summit. One is we know that the president wanted to reopen military-to-military communications. From statements from the Chinese side after the meeting, it looks like that may have happened. But one of the asks that he has is for China to crack down on the export of the raw materials to make fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that's now thought to be the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49. So those precursor chemicals come from China, they land in Mexico, the Mexican drug cartels turn them into fentanyl and then ship them across the border. This is one of the biggest areas in which candidate Biden and President Biden overlap, because it's been a huge issue in America, obviously, not just the number of deaths, but the fact that the Republicans have seized on fentanyl as the fentanyl crisis, and it is a crisis, to hammer President Biden over his border policy. So I thought that was pretty important to look at as well.
I want to play a little bit of the tape that we got between these two leaders earlier today. President Biden was emphasizing the importance of basic communication. Let's watch.
I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And we also have to manage it responsibly, that competition.
Olivier, let's talk about that basic communication. Rhonda was just referring to the military being able to communicate. What does Biden need to take away from this in terms of lines of dialogue with China?
Well, if you listen to both leaders, it was interesting that Biden was coming at this from a we need to talk, and Xi Jinping was coming from this as you need to respect us. And I think for President Biden, I think it's probably sufficient to do two things. One is to get, again, the military-to-military connection reopened. That's pretty important. The Chinese have not always liked that. The Chinese have regarded that kind of contact as actually incentivizing bad behavior, because if you think you can defuse a crisis, why not start one? That's sort of the reasoning. The other thing, though, is you've watched a veritable parade of senior American officials going to China over the last, 6-7 months. You've seen the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. You've seen Janet Yellen from Treasury. You've seen Commerce Secretary Raimondo. There's been a real effort to try to take down the temperature, even as the president is doing things that really annoy the Chinese. There's this embargo might be too strong, but there are Biden administration restrictions on the exports of high-tech components to China. Xi Jinping referred to that kind of embargo, those kinds of restrictions, as a real sore spot. And so the president's been ratcheting up the pressure on the Chinese, but he needs to keep this conversation going because, as my colleagues have mentioned, the last thing he wants is for this competition, which is a very aggressive competition, to turn it into an actual conflict.
James, what does President Xi hope to get out of this visit?
His economy is hurting. In the third quarter of this year, we just got data in the last couple days, foreign direct investment declined for the first time since Tiananmen Square in 1989. That means that businesses, and especially Americans, were taking money out of China, not more than they put in. It is not seen as a safe place to do business or to do work because of the trade war, because of the conflict, because of the fear that Americans will get arrested if they're doing business there, and because of the kind of the tit-for-tat competition and export controls. And so U.S. companies post the pandemic have been trying to move their operations from China to other countries in Southeast Asia where there's more certainty about the ability to do business. It's no coincidence Biden and Xi aren't having dinner tonight. Xi, after this meeting wraps, is going to have dinner with a bunch of American CEOs in San Francisco, and that reflects sort of what he wants coming out of this. He wants American investment back. He wants to convey that China's open for business and that you can trust them, and that he's not going to crack down. He said that before, and then he's cracked down, so there's a lot of fear and trepidation among American businesses. On the other hand, the U.S. continues to be incredibly dependent on China, not just for goods that we buy at Walmart, but that's where most iPhones are made. And so you have to, it's a divorce would be impossible. But so is kind of the old idea of Chimerica, where China and America were going to be one big unit. That obviously isn't tenable either. So it's adjusting to some kind of new dynamic, and if Xi can stabilize the U.S. relationship, bring business investment back in, it makes it easier for him to consolidate power at home, and a weak economy undercuts him.
We're watching for President Biden to speak in just a little bit. We will be watching to see what sorts of questions he gets, because of course the focus right now is on China, but reporters can ask him about anything. So be prepared for any hot topics to come up as he addresses the media. Rhonda, I want to talk to you about how Americans are feeling about China these days. And, you know, James is talking about what President Xi comes here with and what he hopes to take away. President Biden has come in with a certain set of hopes and expectations. But let's talk about how the American public is viewing this superpower.
Yeah, I kind of dug into this ahead of this meeting because I wanted to see where the sentiment is. And if you look at places like Pew, they ask annually a question to Americans asking about China and their feelings toward China. And over the last few years, you have seen Americans grow increasingly skeptical and concerned about China. And just to read some of those poll numbers, and this was taken back in March, but this is an annual question they ask Americans. 83% of Americans say they have an unfavorable view of China. That's up from 79%. Unfavorable, and that's up from 79% when that question was asked last year. They also did a survey in July, so that's a little bit more recent, and they asked in an open-ended question, what country is a threat to the U.S.? Half of Americans responded with China. They could have chosen any country, but it was China that half of Americans say they are concerned about. 17% of Americans are concerned about Russia. So think about that. Half of Americans are concerned first about China, perhaps because of the size, perhaps because of resources. But that is showing that the country is thinking about China. And especially as you head into an election year, you are going to hear more candidates talk about China. You're going to hear more American people talk about China. And it's likely that the issue and issues surrounding that country will come up in our politics even more.
Yeah, Olivier, talk to us more about candidate Biden. You know, you were talking about the sort of dual role that Biden has in a meeting like this. But how does he think about the politics of this in 2024?
Well, he thinks very, very carefully and closely about the politics of this. You know, in the run-up to this summit, we've had reporting in the Washington Post about the Biden administration trying to roll out a big new trade arrangement, not with China, but with countries that sort of ring the Pacific Ocean. It would be sort of, if you want to stretch all the way back to 2016, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which was an effort to cobble together a kind of economic alliance to counter a rising China. Well, the Biden administration has been working on sort of the successor to that. And this week, in the face of complaints from Democrats like Senator Sherrod Brown, senator from Ohio, who's facing a tough re-election fight, they dropped plans to unveil this in San Francisco at APEC. In terms of China itself, you know, he's a China hawk. You wouldn't know it if you listened to Republicans talk about his record, but he is fairly confrontational. And so one of the things that we're going to be listening for in this press conference and in the answers to questions is there any hint of a concession on Taiwan? Is there any hint of a concession on the export controls that so upset Xi Jinping? Is there any step forward, you know, on something like fentanyl, which would be a really important public policy, but also political step for President Biden? So I think that there, you know, you would never get this from the National Security Council readouts or briefings about this summit. But the domestic political considerations are enormous.
Rhonda, how is it coming up on the campaign trail in the Republican field?
Well, one of the more recent situations where you have seen this come up is the GOP debate last week on NBC. The candidates were asked about China in multiple ways, and there was one moment where the candidates were asked about Taiwan, and if China invaded Taiwan, how would that person running for president respond and try to deter China? Most of the candidates kind of danced around the question, not a lot of specifics, but most of them said that they would try to use the naval ships and try to deterring China. But it's really about the fact that that question about Taiwan and China is being brought up in a U.S. presidential election that is telling. It's something that you will likely hear candidate Biden, as Olivier has been saying, address either today or even later on, because he knows that is a point that people may want to hear more about, and specifically because Republicans are going to attack him on anything he says today or moving forward on the issue of China or Taiwan. It's been a pretty influential topic, especially on the Hill. There have been criticisms that President Biden is not tough on China. And honestly, as we start seeing ads for candidates, whether it's presidential candidates or congressional candidates, you'll likely see, that tough on China talk being a part of playbooks.
Let's talk about the bigger global situation, James. When Rhonda talked about the Pew polling, she gave us some context of how Americans are feeling about other adversaries like Russia. But there's a real concern about China's role in Russia, Iran, other places. Can you talk to us about how Biden views China's role in the bigger global scheme?
That China, if it considers itself a superpower, should act like one. That is the message, that China has the power to prevent Russia from using nuclear weapons, for example, because China is the senior partner now in that relationship with Putin. That China, through its trade with Iran, has the ability to, if it wants, according to the president, and Jake Sullivan said this in a call with reporters earlier, the ability to basically push Iran not to intervene on behalf of Hezbollah and open up a northern front against Israel as Israel focuses on Gaza and Hamas. So there is a role, and one of the deliverables that has come out of this meeting is that China and the U.S. are going to restart climate negotiations, which had stopped with what Rhonda was talking about with the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. John Kerry is the Biden administration's climate envoy. It's significant because the big annual climate meeting that the UN has is coming up in Dubai later this month. And so this is just part of the general approach of wanting to get talking, but to not, as Rhonda points out, look weak on China. It's pretty striking that Biden has not relaxed any of the tariffs that Trump imposed on China. Honestly, one of the easiest, most effective ways to get control of inflation would have been to lower the tariffs. But Biden decided that the political risk of reducing the tariffs and the blowback that would cause was not worth the decline in inflation he would have gotten by lifting the tariffs. So that tells you the kind of the politics when 82% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China, that the president is basically putting the politics above the very real economic gains that could be had by warming relations.
James, we talked earlier about the optics and how carefully they're being controlled to sort of buffer and insulate what President Xi and his entourage see and experience. Let's talk about how San Francisco has prepared to host APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Summit.
They've really taken, this is the biggest meeting of foreign leaders in San Francisco since the United Nations Charter was signed in 1946. This is a big deal for San Francisco. I was talking to someone who is involved in San Francisco politics and with Mayor London Breed, who was saying that Mayor Breed really hopes that this is sort of this galvanizing moment that helps them say San Francisco's back. That San Francisco's brand has been really hurt the last couple of years because of high crime. The fentanyl crisis that Olivier was talking about has hit San Francisco probably harder than any other city in America. And so as part of this summit, they've really spruced up the city. They've moved the big homeless encampments away from downtown. They've basically run off all the fentanyl dealers. There's open air drug markets in San Francisco. Police have basically pushed away a lot of the criminal elements. And so the city is cleaner than it's been in a long time. A lot of San Francisco residents are saying, we want it to stay this way. And Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, was asked about this.
Yeah, let's actually listen to that. I have that tape ready to go thanks to our team in our control room. This is Gavin Newsom addressing some of the preparation that did, just as James said, get this city ready to host this international event and be on the global stage.
I know folks say, oh, they're just cleaning up this place because all those fancy leaders are coming into town. That's true, because it's true. Anytime you put on an event, by definition, you have people over your house, you're going to clean up the house. You're going to make sure the kids, make their beds, take the socks, let's put them in the drawer, in the hamper. And that's, you have 21 world leaders, you got tens of thousands of people coming from all around the globe. What an opportunity to showcase the world's most extraordinary place, San Francisco.
That's California Governor Gavin Newsom. Rhonda.
Yeah, you know, it's not unique that a city would clean up or try to put its best foot forward when they are having this light shown on them. But it is telling, and it also shows you how serious this is. And I know Yasmin, our reporter who's there on the ground, talked about all the things that went into the choreography of this meeting and putting it together. I mean, you even think about the things like the menu when they had Biden and Xi had their working lunch a few hours ago, and the things that were on that menu. And it was herb ravioli, if you guys didn't follow that from the pool report, and some other things. But not too many Chinese dishes either. And these are important points that are discussed ahead of time. Yasmin talked about, you know, the steps she would have to walk, how many steps. It's really a critical moment in geopolitics that a city, a state, and also the country doesn't really want to mess up or even attempt to have any problems when there are so many things on the line.
And one of the things too is, you know, and this is less good than cleaning up the city, is keeping protesters away. The Chinese government was incredibly sensitive to, you know, they didn't want Falun Gong or any of the kind of other anti-Chinese government groups protesting Xi, and so really the signage that he's seen with his motorcade has been very positive, signs in Chinese that say "Welcome President Xi," and so, you know, the flip side of the city being clean and spruced up is that they are keeping protesters and dissent pretty far away from anything that the Chinese leader will see, which you know, you can have mixed feelings about, but he certainly does not get that back home in China either, and that's one of the reasons that his emissaries didn't want him to be exposed to it here.
We are waiting for President Biden to speak. He is going to take some questions from the press after he's had this meeting today with the Chinese president. And this is just part of the APEC summit. So I want to go back to Olivier to give us a sense of why the summit itself is important and significant. We've been talking about, of course, San Francisco hosting it, but it's important to many people beyond San Franciscans. Olivier.
Let me add one little nugget to the cleaning up of San Francisco, which is the Chinese are enormously sensitive to the possibility that the Chinese president might hear or be confronted by protesters. And part of that is that in the Obama era, a protester from the Falun Gong religious group got on the White House grounds when Hu Jintao was visiting and basically heckled him. And the entourage of the Chinese president briefly considered actually just pulling up stakes and ending the visit right there. So they are enormously sensitive to that. In terms of the APEC summit, you know, I mean, obviously everyone is watching the most important bilateral relationship in the world today, which is the China-America relationship, watching for signs of a thaw, watching for shifts on things like Taiwan, watching for changes on things like export controls, really watching to see how these two world leaders circle around each other, what deals they reach, because these are the two 800-pound gorillas in the room. What they do, if I can distort and adapt an old saying, when either of these countries sneezes, a whole region gets a cold. It's enormously important. China is an economic, political, and military behemoth. It has extended its influence, whether by militarizing parts of the South China Sea that it claims against international law belong to it, to what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure in other countries as another effort to gain influence. So every country in the world is affected by this relationship. The Europeans have been watching nervously as President Biden imposes export controls and wages sort of a low-grade economic war with the Chinese. And so this matters to basically every country in the world.
Olivier, I want you to talk more about that relationship of these two men, not just as world leaders, but just going back in their history of how they've encountered each other in the past.
Sure, they've encountered each other in the past, notably when Biden was vice president. So they had some interactions there. You know, interestingly, Xi Jinping has been coming to the United States for years and years and years and years. About a decade ago, I was talking to the Iowa governor, who casually dropped into conversation that Xi Jinping had come to Iowa as sort of a mid-level Chinese government functionary, in part because China buys so much foodstuffs from Iowa. So he's had a long relationship with America and a fairly long one with President Biden. But the Xi Jinping of today is different from the Xi Jinping of even just a few years ago. James is absolutely right that he's arrived to the United States in a moment of unique vulnerability. I mean, his place at the head of the Communist Party, his place at the head of the Chinese government is not really in question, but the weakness of the economy is terrible. I mean, it's bad enough, youth unemployment is bad enough that China has stopped publishing official data about that. They have a real estate crisis. They're being squeezed by these export controls. Xi Jinping has tried to squeeze foreign companies. He's actually made it a little harder to do business in China, which is one of the reasons that foreign direct investment has dropped. So he's arriving somewhat vulnerable, even though he's shored up his political position. Biden, of course, is going into a 12-month period of aggressive campaign for another term. So they each came to the table today wanting a few things. Maybe not huge developments. Certainly on the U.S. side, they were playing down, way down, way down, the idea of a major breakthrough. But they needed to show that each side needed to show that they could manage this relationship. Each side needed to ease concerns around the world that things were heading in a bad direction. And now we're listening to President Biden to hear just what he got from Xi Jinping at the table. Some of which, of course, will take time to assess. Reopening military-to-military communication, we can assess that pretty quickly. But a Chinese pledge to cut down or cut back or cut out shipments of precursor chemicals to the production of fentanyl in Mexico, we're going to need a while to assess whether that's actually working. The Chinese have made similar pledges in the past and have not kept them.
James, I want you to talk a little bit more about the relationship and compare and contrast it with that of President Trump and President Xi. What kind of shape did he leave that relationship in as he left office?
Well, it is really interesting. You mentioned this is the first time that Xi has been in the U.S. since 2017, and that was a trip to Mar-a-Lago. And it was a very different time where Trump, the way Olivier is absolutely right, that Xi has changed. Trump obviously changed too over the course of his administration. At the beginning, he ran obviously in 2016 about pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I think he thought he could have a good relationship with Xi. And that they could sort of work together well. Trump thought of himself as sort of someone who understood China, understood strong men. At one point at a fundraiser joked that it was great that Xi can be president for life, and he wished he could too. But then things sort of soured, and Trump essentially at one point on Twitter declared trade wars are good and easy to win, and then imposed a bunch of tariffs. They thought that they would be able to get China to the table to make concessions. China hunkered down, was unwilling to do so. Then things sort of spiraled from there. John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor, wrote in his memoir that there was this meeting between Trump and Xi, and Trump basically asked Xi to help him out to get reelected. And it was a big scandalous thing when the Bolton book came out. Trump denied it, but Bolton, the credible figure there, saying that Trump had said, look, if you help me out, lift some of this pressure on the United States, I'll get reelected and then I'll have more favorable terms for you. And so I think Trump was trying to manage the relationship, struggled to do so. And then, of course, what we haven't talked about is COVID hit. And that really did sort of upend things. For example, in 2019, there was this agreement that China was going to buy a lot more U.S. food. And then China really didn't end up living up to its end of the bargain, but really couldn't, in part because of COVID. And then, Donald Trump was blaming China for the virus, calling it the Wuhan flu, or at one point Donald Trump literally called it the Kung flu. And so those kinds of statements really antagonized the Chinese, and that further deteriorated relations. And that's partly how we got to this position, and now Trump is running as a real hardliner on China, and so there has been a shift there. China's intentions have also sort of shifted. The U.S. political climate has become a lot harsher to China, as Rhonda was talking about.
We are awaiting President Biden at his press conference. In the meantime, though, I'm joined by Michael Birnbaum, national security reporter, covering perfectly for us diplomacy and the State Department. Michael, James is giving us this context of the history of U.S. leaders' relationship with Xi Jinping in particular, in China in general. To start off your conversation, give us a gauge, just a temperature reading of how you would characterize and classify the relationship between the two countries, and then specifically between Biden and Xi.
Well, it's in recent years, it's clearly had some ups and downs. At the moment, actually, over the last, let's say, 5 months or so, they've kind of gotten things much more under control. It's even keeled. There's a more regular series of check-ins between senior officials of both countries, and that has enabled a more productive working relationship that they didn't have earlier. For the first stretch of the Biden administration, but particularly from August 2022 into the early part of this year, they really weren't talking to each other, and there were attempts to restart conversations, but things were really troubled. And so at the State Department, in the White House, they said this is not a good thing, not a good thing for stability. It's helpful for managing global affairs to have some kind of ongoing conversation. Secretary of State Antony Blinken went to China in June, which resumed the sort of put an end to this period of silence between the two countries. Since then, there have been a number of cabinet secretaries in China. Wang Yi came to Washington a couple of weeks ago, and what the State Department say is that with every increased contact, they can just sort of continue their conversation, leaving off from as they were talking the previous time. That wasn't possible in June, when each side had an accumulated list of grievances they had to get through. And so they do feel as though there's a more productive conversation now. You asked about the personal relationship between President Xi and President Biden. They, I think, have they have a working relationship. They've known each other for years. President Biden, of course, immediately after, as Blinken was on his way back from the trip to China in June, President Biden had these remarks calling Xi a dictator. That didn't go over well in China. But I think that fundamentally, they both, these are major rivals, but they both need each other in a lot of ways for maintaining stability, for maintaining predictability. And so there's a fundamental working relationship that they can just move through. I think President Xi was quite publicly annoyed with Biden's comments, but China needs this relationship with the United States, and in a lot of ways, the Chinese leaders have moved on. I think that's a sign. So I was in the Mideast last week, traveling with Blinken. And again, this need for regulating an unstable, unpredictable world with multiple wars going on, clearly on the mind of the Americans. And I think they hope that the Chinese can help maintain that stability, avoid flare-ups and even greater, expanded wars. That's among the things that are going into these conversations today.
Michael, stay with us. I just want to update our viewers. We are awaiting President Biden's press conference. They are running late. It looks like there's been some rain in Woodside, California. They're, of course, near San Francisco, which you can see from our backdrop right here. They are moving things indoors, and we'll have that press conference as soon as they bring it to us. Olivier, I want to go to you for more on what Michael is talking about. As Blinken makes this, this global circles trying to work through stability and trying to do a lot of mediation and diplomacy. What is the view, do you have the sense of Xi Jinping and the Chinese in terms of their view of what global stability would look like?
That's a great question. What we know from Chinese help to Russia in the middle of its campaign to crush Ukraine what we know about China's expansion in the South China Sea, about its use of the Belt and Road Initiative to expand its influence, what we think we know is that the Chinese are acting like a fairly conventional superpower in terms of extending its interests. And that's bringing it into some conflict and competition with the Americans. I think Michael was right to point out that in the last X number of months, there has been that parade of senior officials going to China and trying to address the relationship on various different levels. I think that is important. The news we're getting now out of the summit from the Chinese side is it appears that they're resuming military-to-military communication. It appears that they've agreed to some kind of dialogue about artificial intelligence. It seems like they've agreed on a working group to discuss counter-narcotics, which I think is basically code for fentanyl. But it looks like American officials were right to play down the expectations of any kind of significant breakthrough.
James, let's go to you for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they did manage expectations pretty well, that a win would just be talking, right? That we're not in the era of, certainly 25 years ago when the Clinton administration was trying to bring China into the World Trade Organization, and there would be these long lists of deliverables at the end of meetings. Part of it is that China has a record of making big promises and not following through. I mentioned the big promise to buy agricultural products and how COVID messed that up, but they also promised that they would no longer launch cyber attacks in the United States, and they didn't follow through on that. They announced that they would work together on AI, and they didn't follow through on that. So there have been a bunch of different promises over the years where China says they'll cooperate, and then they don't. And so I think that there's a recognition that rather than just kind of make concessions to China for them to say they're going to do something, that you sort of have to, trust but verify.
Congress is watching so closely to see what comes out of this, both the managing expectations game and also what the deliverables will be. Rhonda.
No, absolutely. China is an active subject on the Hill. That's one thing, one issue that does seem to create some bipartisanship. You might remember at the beginning of this year, when the Republicans took control of the House, they set up a select committee on China that was passed with bipartisan support. And the chair of that committee did send President Biden a letter ahead of this meeting with Xi asking for, quote, demands that his committee had for Biden to bring up in this meeting. And as James pointed out, the White House really managed expectations on this. And even Biden, when he spoke yesterday, said that, manage your expectations. This is just a baby step. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. But in that letter that members of Congress sent to Biden, Republican members, they asked for certain things. Of course, fentanyl was an issue, stemming that, the precursors or the ingredients for fentanyl. They also asked to get commitments on releasing people who are U.S. citizens who are wrongfully detained, according to the U.S., by the PRC. So that was a part of their demands as well. And to cease military operations outside of Taiwan's air defense zones. So those are some of the areas that China Select Committee in the House asked President Biden to address. Of course, the reality is, as we've all been pointing out, that these are baby steps, basically. These are optics. These are showing leaders of both of these countries walking alongside the mansion that they were at today, appearing to be in good spirits. That's a start. That's what the White House wanted. And perhaps once Biden does fill us in on what happened, we will learn a little bit more on that. But China is a very active conversation on the Hill.
Well, let's hear a little bit of what Chinese President Xi Jinping shared earlier today. This is when they were sitting down, the cameras were rolling at first, and this is the Chinese president speaking through an interpreter.
China-U.S. relationship has never been smooth sailing over the past 50 years or more, and it always faces problems of one kind or another. Yet it has kept moving forward amid twists and turns. For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides. I'm still of the view that major country competition is not the prevailing trend of current times and cannot solve the problems facing China and the United States or the world at large.
Let's go to Michael. Michael, when you hear the Chinese president talk, what sort of subtext or overt text do you listen for and look for?
Well, he's talking about major power competition. and a lot of what United States foreign policy is focused on right now. I mean, they want to manage that grand, long-running competition with China, but they're faced with the short-run problems and challenges of a war in Ukraine and a war now in Gaza and Israel. And so, I think that I'm certainly interested in hearing his discussion about stability and managing these challenges. Clearly, China is, supplying Russia, engaged in the war with Ukraine, interested in preventing Russia's failure. But, a lot of United States officials feel as though they're also interested in containing the war in Ukraine, and potentially preventing Iran's direct entry into the conflict in Israel and Gaza. So, in terms of managing those hot wars right now, I'm listening for the kinds of things that she is talking about, and interested ultimately in what President Biden has to say about how the two leaders talked about those issues. I think, they've been playing down expectations about major deliverables, major agreements, but at the same time, convincing the Chinese to use their influence with Iran, with other Arab nations in the region, convincing the Chinese to use their influence with Moscow. Those are, wins. Those are potential wins if they can contain the conflicts and rein things in. That's not going to be something that's obvious today, or even weeks from now, but nevertheless is an important part of this diplomacy.
James, there's also the question of how does it look? Who's pushing who? Because, of course, President Xi doesn't want to look like he is being told what to do by the U.S. or even being guided or led to a decision by the U.S.
Right. And so that is the balancing act, where the biggest win out of this meeting might be that maybe China doesn't help out Russia fighting Ukraine as much as it might have. And that's not something that gets announced, but it's sort of a gesture of building goodwill between the two sides to allow for something better to happen later. But they're not going to put out a press release where Xi says, I'm now pulling back on my support for Russia, or I'm going to release these Americans who are wrongfully detained in China. There has been a really interesting shift lately on Chinese state media, which has been incredibly harsh toward the United States over the last couple of years, but has actually in recent days been praising the Americans on official state TV today for taking the first step by allowing more flights to go from China to the United States, allowing more student exchanges. So the regime in Beijing is laying the groundwork for a kind of a warming approach toward the United States. It is really striking that the two sides agreed not to put out a joint statement. It is incredibly common in these sorts of meetings. Even the Biden-Putin meeting in 2021, that the Russians and the U.S. put out a joint communique. And so it's very bland. It's both sides agree to it. It feels like it's written by a committee. In practice, it's not all that important, but it gets a lot of attention. The two sides in this situation said, let's not put out a joint statement. So to your question, Libby, what that allows both sides to do is to basically put their spin on it for their own domestic audiences. So Biden is going to get to control with his own readout, sort of his version of events, and Xi will have a readout, to the extent that there is one in an authoritarian country, of his version of events, and it will make it easier for both sides to sort of claim victory.
We're watching the podium get set up there in Woodside, California, where President Biden will be speaking shortly. You saw images, if you've been with us for a little while now, earlier of a podium outside. Then we saw the cover go over it, which indicated bad weather. And now they've picked up sticks as we call it, the tripods are, and they've gone inside, and we'll see this press conference shortly. I want to change the tone a little bit and talk about something near and dear to Washingtonians' hearts, and I think people really all over the country, and that's the pandas. Because the pandas at the National Zoo here in Washington, D.C. left this month. You're watching some footage of the pandas before they left us. Let's talk about the diplomacy and the question of panda diplomacy, James.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is going to have no pandas for the first time since Nixon went to China. I mean, it's going to have been this very long era where in like think tank circles, when you're talking to or about China hands, you're either considered a panda hugger or a dragon slayer. That's like kind of the shorthand, which is obviously way reductionist, but for whether you're want conciliation with China and trade and openness, or whether you're kind of a hawk and tough on China.
And if people don't know what they're seeing, if they haven't seen this footage, it's the pandas being loaded on their journey, at the first step of their journey heading to China.
Yeah, and in fact, they left the National Zoo. You can see that was November 8th. So last week, they got a motorcade with a police escort from the National Zoo to Dulles, and a panda's even painted on that FedEx 747. I mean, it's the end of an era. Traditionally, I saw a chart recently that showed that basically every time China wants to improve its image on the world stage, like right after Tiananmen, they were handing out pandas like candy around the world and giving them to all these Western zoos, not just in the US, but in Canada and Europe. And it was about improving China's brand overseas. And we've been in this kind of harsher era where they haven't wanted to let the pandas stay. They've been trying to pull the pandas back. Originally, the pandas were actually supposed to leave the US on November 15th, but they didn't want the juxtaposition of, Biden and Xi meeting and then the pandas leaving. They wanted the pandas to be gone before the presidents met for this summit, so that it didn't seem, to your earlier point, Libby, like a loss, like the U.S. was conceding and giving up the pandas. It was part of a contractual agreement for the care and feeding of these animals, and that they were supposed to go back over time. But it is a big change. I mean, it's such a important part of DC's culture, having these animals there. I think it's probably, if you made a list of the top 5 things people do when they come to visit Washington, certainly going to see the pandas, I'd put on up there.
Yeah.
So many people did. There were so many crowds that day, waking up early to see that. So, yeah. It also shows you how serious this is, that something like pandas being returned to China and how carefully choreographed that was.
They did not want it to happen today, November 15th.
Right. It shows you that, those who are figuring out these events, figuring out these meetings, have to think of everything. Because not only are Americans watching this meeting or the president's remarks soon, Beijing is watching. And people in China are watching. So, and of course, they may get readouts that are different from the readouts we get.
It'll be a controlled view.
Exactly. But it's still something that's being watched. I think Olivier also mentioned Europe will be watching. So these are things that though it brings us a little bit of levity in this discussion about the pandas, it's still something that is a part of that whole seriousness of making sure that this critical moment turns out right.
Fun fact. When this was the original Nixon going to China moment, this all sort of grew from that. The Chinese gave us 2 pandas. We gave them 2 oxen. No reports on whatever ended up happening to those oxes, but I think we got the better end of that trade 50 years ago.
We might have.
Olivier, do you have anything to contribute on the loss of the pandas?
Shameless panda hugging from the panel here.
Yes.
I think this clears the way for the far superior red panda to take its rightful place at the National Zoo. I mean, we talk about the pandas being used for PR, but I think if we're looking at the numbers that Rhonda mentioned earlier, I'm going to mix this metaphor till it's within an inch of its life. The pandas are clearly not a silver bullet. They clearly have not, in fact, changed the impression of most Americans about China. I obviously come to this as not a particularly big panda fan. I think they're overly expensive, boring creatures. But it is a moment. It is actually more telling that they staggered the timing to avoid the impression this was some kind of a slight or a consequence from this meeting. I've covered a lot of summits. They stage manage these things just down to the second, where people will stand, who will open what door, where they will come in, who gets what kind of water at the table, what kind of pens people have. The Russians used to do something. The Russians used to park the American, delineate the summit space so that the restroom the Americans could use was as far as possible from the room where the two sides were meeting. On several trips overseas, the U.S. side wanted to know, is there an elevator to reach this place? How far is this walk? It's really stage managed. It's even more stage managed than presidential debates, in which they discuss, where should the thermostat be set and things like that. So it is interesting to me that they tried to stagger that they did stagger the panda departure.
And just to be clear, the anti-panda opinion is solely that of Olivier Knox and not the entire Washington Post nor this program. And you can write to him at the Daily 202. And James, I just want to be a little more specific. It was musk oxen that were sent.
Yes,
and as a former Alaskan, that is an important distinction as an Arctic animal. Michael, I do wonder about the optics of this. And, all love, or apparently Olivier's hang up with pandas aside, why is this such a symbol of China's sort of, I don't necessarily want to use this soft power because that has its own definition, but this soft diplomacy, or this ability to try to connect with people around the world in other ways besides just the strong fist?
Well, I mean, it is cute and fuzzy. I don't think boring effort to present an important part of Chinese zoology, Chinese culture to kids, to people on their free time. It's not political, or not explicitly political, at least. And clearly in the United States, it's been a popular part of zoos and the Chinese-U.S. relationship, the more positive aspects of the Chinese-U.S. relationship for decades. I mean, as Olivier says correctly, it has not prevented conflict between the United States and China, but at the same time, it has been part of this more ordinary, workaday, daily relationship of, positive, meaningful contacts on a lower and less geopolitical level. And so now that appears to be winding down, at least for now, that is a sign of the chillier relationship. In the 1990s into the 2000s, as the Soviet Union had fallen and Russia was kind of establishing itself, there was a tremendous amount of cultural exchange there. Russian ballet dancers coming to the United States all the time, and people talking about how this is the grand cultural exchange between two former rivals. The pandas kind of functioned in the same way. And, speaking as the father of two little kids who like going to the National Zoo, I think that that kind of opportunity, the chance to talk about China not as a sort of scary big country with weapons and a major competitor of the United States, but as a very big country with a rich old history, rich old civilization, and lots of interesting animals that also work well in stuffed form in gift shops. That's a nice aspect of that relationship, and for now, clearly, that's going to be on hold.
This is live coverage from the Washington Post. We're watching for President Biden to come out any moment. He's in Woodside, California. He's just had this meeting with President Xi, and we are expecting the President of the United States, Joe Biden, to take some questions from the media that you see gathered there. We've been talking about some of this cultural connection, or the disconnect sometimes between the two countries, but I want to return this, Olivier, to something very serious, which is China's aspirations and goals. We've talked about Taiwan a bit. We haven't really talked about Hong Kong. There is the question of just how much influence, both in its own geographical region, China would like to have, as well as globally. I'm thinking about the Arctic and other places.
Oh yeah, I mean, we are in a full-on superpower competition. I mean, I appreciate that that Xi Jinping says this, great power competition is not the way of international relations today. Well, it very much is. I'm sorry. They are looking at all this. Some of Xi's grievances make me think of a passage in George W. Bush's book, Decision Points. Bush in the book said that whenever he met a foreign leader for the first time, he asked them, "What keeps you up at night?" Now, frankly, that would be a great book to read, all the answers. The only one he provides in the book is Hu Jintao, who was the leader of China at the time. And Hu Jintao looks at Bush and says, "I have to create 25 million jobs a year." That gives you something of the dilemma here for Xi Jinping, that he is coming here at a time when his economy is not doing well. He is struggling. Some of what Biden is doing directly affects that. The export controls on high-tech inputs is hurting the Chinese economy. At the same time, he's hurting the Chinese economy himself by imposing all these new rules, by making it harder for foreign companies to do business there. By detaining dual citizens or American citizens, by raiding prominent American companies there. So on the one hand, they have a fairly expansive agenda overseas. Again, they're using infrastructure investments, billions and billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure investments to try to gain influence in places like Africa, to try to secure access to enormously strategic and important raw materials. Rare earth materials, stuff that goes into high-tech products. They are deepening their economic relationship, or they've been trying to deepen their economic relationship with Europe, which on balance is more dependent on the Chinese economy than the United States is. They have been helping Russia, but it's complicated because one of the things that they do whenever Russia gets in a bind is that the Chinese will offer to buy Russian oil, but at a pretty serious discount. They are worried about what they describe, using an old Cold War term, they are worried about encirclement. They're looking at American alliances throughout the Pacific, and they are concerned at every turn, and you heard this in Xi Jinping's remarks, that somehow the United States is trying to stifle China, surround China, undermine China. That came through really loud and clear in Xi Jinping's comments, and it's very clear. I was only able to glance at some of the Chinese readout, but it's very clear in that readout as well that they're very anxious about what they see as an attempt by the United States to curtail their economic development, which of course is a direct threat to Xi Jinping.
It's just after 8 o'clock on the East Coast, just after 5 p.m. where President Biden is, Woodside, California. You can see there the podium where we will see the president make remarks shortly. The big question the reporters will have, of course, is just how this meeting went with Chinese President Xi. But he may also get questions on a range of other topics, Rhonda and James, ranging from what's happening right now in Gaza to what's happening here domestically in United States politics. James, set the scene for us of where President Biden is at in his presidency when it comes to the balance of international diplomacy and relations with domestic issues back here at home.
It's such a good point because I think Joe Biden sees himself as a statesman. He sees himself as this international president who has more foreign policy experience than anyone who's ever come into the job, first elected to the Senate more than 50 years ago. And I think, honestly, his favorite part of the job is flying to Israel, going into Kyiv to meet with Zelensky, having these summits with heads of state. The challenge is that while he is seen as a statesman, you don't want it to seem like it's at the expense of the issues that American voters care about the most, which is rising prices. And so Biden and his national security team, Jake Sullivan was actually, has a background in domestic policy as much as foreign policy, has really emphasized kind of making foreign policy about serving the American middle class. So they go out of their way to make it seem like the president is not distracted by foreign policy at the expense of domestic policy. But you saw what happened to George H.W. Bush in 1992, where he triumphantly organized this coalition that prevailed in Operation Desert Storm. And then a year and a half later, he loses because he's perceived as bad on the economy. And Joe Biden is incredibly weak in his perceived performance on the economy. And so part of the interactions with China is getting to a place where he seems tough, but he also kind of keeps the flow of goods going, keeps prices down. So he's trying to do both, but he and this is sort of a sweet spot for him, where I think he really does see himself as this is in his wheelhouse. This is what he's good at.
Yeah, I'd agree with that because of his history as a senator. He was over the Foreign Affairs Committee. And you've seen him throughout the conflicts or potential conflicts sort of be very transparent, or at least show that he's trying to give answers to the American people, whether it was about Ukraine, whether it was talking about Israel. That's one thing I'm listening out for this, because of course this is going to give us a sense of what happened in the meeting with Xi, but it's also going to potentially touch on these other topics. Of course, we know that China has friendly relations with Iran. Iran has been suspected of helping Hamas out. So if they were able to talk about that, or we get a sense of that was something that Biden brought up, that might be a win for the White House.
Right, we see the president's team there, some of the folks who were gathered earlier. President Biden will be taking questions from reporters in Woodside, California. I'd like to thank our entire Washington Post team who's been reporting from there on location, as well as joining us tonight here in our studio. We won't be hearing from President Xi tonight. He is not part of this. This is not a joint press conference, which world leaders often do, frankly. James, talk to us about the significance of some of these faces that we're seeing go by. Everyone from John Kirby to John Kerry. Yeah.
John Kirby to John Kerry. So John Kerry is the climate envoy, and that is one of the deliverables out of this meeting, that the U.S. and China are going to start talking again about combating climate change. And there is a lot of room to work together there. And John Kirby, who's the spokesman for the National Security Council, a former admiral in the Navy, a reflection of the very real national security implications with this meeting, and basically, trying to prevent China from bailing out Russia or Iran, and then various other advisors from the National Security Council and from the State Department.
Olivier, what should we read into the fact that we're not seeing these two world leaders stand at side-by-side podiums tonight?
You don't need to read too much into it. I mean, the fact that there was not a joint statement is important, but they are pretty mindful on the Chinese side about shall we say, the perils of calling on American journalists. So it's very common to see what we usually call a 2 and 2 when the president meets with another world leader, but there are some world leaders who are disinclined to do that. The Chinese leaders typically are in that category. One of the things to watch for here is what tone the White House wants to set, which they will do not just with President Biden's opening statement, but which news outlet he calls on first. That'll give you a sense of the intended audience. It'll give you a sense of what they want to be asked about. My old shop, AFP, would be pretty much guaranteed to ask a question about the summit. But
that's Agence France Presse. So
that's right.
People know who that is. Yep.
That's right. But there are other. If we think he's taking 4 questions, we'll see who he calls on, because that's one way that a White House can sort of keep control of the agenda at an event like this. So that'll be something to watch for as well.
Michael, I may have to cut you off if we see President Biden come out, but what will you be listening for?
Well, I'm certainly going to be interested in what he says about, the conversations that they had about dealing with Iran, if he volunteers any information about that, dealing with Russia. As I think Olivier said earlier, sometimes these relationship managing issues don't necessarily get put out in front of the reporters or the public immediately, but trying to understand the extent to which we can glean whether China was interested in that kind of cooperation and managing these conflicts and pushing for stability. In general, they've indicated, I think, in private channels ahead of the meeting that they would be, but certainly any kind of Biden readout about how those talks went. And of course, gotta know whether the pandas are coming back on the stuff and children front. So I'm curious about that.
One can only hope, Michael. One can only hope. Rhonda, of course, members of Congress are already responding to the meeting today, so they'll be listening to this closely as well.
That's right. And as I've said, that China is a big topic on the Hill. Actually, I looked up the number of pieces of legislation that this term has been entered by Congress, and it was upward of 700. Last term of Congress, it was more than 1,000. So you see an uptick of legislation, whether it's a resolution, whether it's a bill, whether it passes or is just introduced, you see it entered. And it's stunning because 10 years ago, it was only a handful of measures that mentioned China. And all of the issues that these pieces of legislation cover, trade, fentanyl, it's just AI, all sorts of things. So Congress is keeping an eye on this. They're also keeping an eye on themselves and how they might deal with China. But again, it's going to be a political and potentially a legislative issue going down the road.
Yeah, he's definitely going to get asked about Taiwan, and it will be interesting to see his posture because he doesn't want to be overly antagonistic after this meeting and sort of undermine it. Something else, we'll see if he gets asked. Olivier's right. This is why the Chinese leaders don't want to come out for a press conference. It's about human rights. One of the pieces of legislation Congress did pass in a bipartisan way was to prevent the buying of cotton from Xinjiang, where the U.S. government has said China is committing a genocide and crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs, who are Muslims. And so the White House sort of said that Biden would raise human rights. He sort of, that is part of America's moral compass and everything. You can raise it to different extents. You can mention it in passing. You can make it a priority. It doesn't seem like it was a priority going into the summit, but it would be interesting if Biden was asked whether it came up, especially in the kind of against the backdrop of U.S. support for Israel vis-a-vis the kind of a potential, the deaths of civilians, and it raises a bunch of different questions. So you could see a human rights question that maybe tries to thread the needle between China and the Middle East.
Yeah, I want you to talk more about the Uyghurs for a moment, James, while we have this opportunity, because we really haven't talked about that and the concerns, the grave concerns about human rights abuses by China.
I mean, it is horrifying. I mean, they really, objectively are trying to eradicate an entire people. The Han Chinese are trying to basically get rid of this Muslim culture. They've destroyed literally tens of thousands of mosques. They have hyper surveillance over millions of people and won't let them leave the region where they live. They've put them in re-education camps, slave labor camps. I mean, it is genuinely awful, and there's kind of incontrovertible proof that that's what's happening. And so the Congress did take action. The president did sign it into law, and that is against this backdrop of you want to have kind of cooperation, you want to have open channels of communication, you want military to military contact, but you also don't want to look the other way as like, what is a truly awful thing is happening by this country that does consider itself a superpower, but often hasn't acted like it.
And then, of course, it's just the question of precedent setting and what does it give the sort of wink and nod about what's allowed in other countries by other cultures. We're still watching this podium here, Olivier, so forgive me if I do have to cut you off. But something we haven't really talked about tonight is TikTok. And when you hear, as Rhonda's been covering the presidential race on the campaign trail, when you hear these candidates talk, someone like Nikki Haley brings up TikTok all the time in her stump speech. Talk to us about that tonight.
So the concern about TikTok has actually evolved over time. Obviously, this is an enormous, for those of you who are my age and older, this is a social media site, short videos, and its parent company is based in China. And initially, the concerns were that TikTok was basically vacuuming up a lot of personal information on its users, and that information was being stored in China, or at least accessible to China. The concern has evolved, and it's really accelerated in the last few weeks. The new concern is that China would use TikTok to spread misinformation across the United States in the event of a crisis. So you can imagine, I don't know, if the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan, a wave of accounts posting Taiwan's side of the story on TikTok, where more and more Americans are getting their news. So the concern has shifted from the information question to the propaganda question. You're seeing a bunch of states that are banning TikTok, restricting access to TikTok on government devices. There's something of a push at the federal level to do the same thing. But you're right, we have not heard a lot about that, and I sort of wonder whether one of the questions tonight might be of the president, did you come to some kind of agreement on TikTok? Do you still plan to? There are going to be a lot of do you still plan to? One of the, James alluded to this. What if someone gets up tonight and says, you've said repeatedly that if China attacked Taiwan, the United States would come to Taiwan's defense militarily. After this meeting, do you still feel that way? But on the TikTok question, it is a really interesting problem. I think we just saw data this week that more and more Americans are getting their information there and not on the site formerly known as Twitter quite as much.
We'll have to decide if we take that clip of Olivier explaining what TikTok is and put it, indeed, on TikTok, Olivier. Rhonda, this has come up in Congress a lot. We've seen hearings about it. I love that you were digging through the bills to look how much China was mentioned. This is something Congress is concerned about. Yeah, very concerned. In fact, the day that the CEO of TikTok was there on the Hill, that was one of the busiest days I've seen this term, outside of the Speaker's vote that we just covered for the last few weeks. But it is a topic, an active topic on the Hill right now. The legislation that was created by Mark Warner, Marco Rubio also has a piece of legislation that would have a federal ban that's still being discussed. It has not passed, but it's still an open question. So you have to wonder, was that a part of this discussion today, or will it be moving forward with President Biden and any members of the Chinese government? I will say that Secretary Gina Raimondo, was a part of the delegation, the U.S. delegation to this meeting. I'm not sure if we saw her on screen just yet, but she would be a part of curbing or banning TikTok. If that legislation was passed, it would be passed off to the Secretary of Commerce. So she does play an important role in that discussion as well. But again, nothing has passed yet on the Hill, but it's a very active conversation. You hear it all the time. In fact, this morning I followed a Senate hearing, rather a House hearing, where Chris Wray talked to House members about global threats. China came up a lot in the questions, and it is seen as something or a country that needs to be watched by Congress. So we'll see what next moves happen, but it's certainly active conversation. Yeah, and Michael, there's the issues that the presidents talk about between themselves, and then there's all the different issues that get talked about lower down the ladder. And the Commerce Secretary and others have been very active in the dialogue with China. Can you talk about those differences to us?
Yeah, well, the conversations that the presidents have, sometimes the thorniest, but also the highest level, between any two superpowers. I mean, not like there are a lot of them, but there are just so many different issues of cooperation, of rivalry. I think Rhonda mentioned earlier, James also mentioned John Kerry, who is the United States climate envoy. He has a constant series of conversations with his Chinese counterpart because he's making the bet, China, world's biggest polluter, is because it's the biggest polluter, is the most important country in the world for addressing the challenge of climate change, and any kind of progress he can make with the Chinese on emissions, on clean energy, renewable energy, will be key, is really the only key to addressing those kinds of problems. And again and again on so many different issues. Gina Raimondo, dealing with issues of trade, issues of technology, and the sort of Chinese control over the global chip industry and semiconductors. All of these relationships in so many different fields are just tremendously important for the stability of the global economy, for the stability of the American economy. And so, these are not, when the two presidents get together, they might, hit the bullet points, hit the highlights, try to address some of the biggest, thorniest problems that their subordinates can't deal with. But at the same time, there's a lot of discussion at lower levels that's ongoing. And I think there's a lot of rivalry. There is a lot of unhappiness between Beijing and Washington at lower levels as well. But at the same time, there's also a sort of more productive, less ideological working relationship on some issues. And on climate, Kerry is trying to work out, announced the basics of a partnership, I think just yesterday, earlier this week, with the Chinese. That's looking ahead to, in a couple weeks' time, a major UN annual climate change conference where all the countries in the world come together, send representatives, and try to make some progress. But really, the U.S.-Chinese relationship on that front is the key driver of progress or stagnation. And so, these are the kinds of things that are happening at the lower level, the sub-presidential level.
Michael Birnbaum, Olivier Knox, Rhonda Colvin, James Homan, and our colleagues in California who've been reporting live, including Yasmin Abutalib, who's been able to share insights from there on the ground in Woodside, California. Thanks to all of you. We're watching for President Biden to come out and speak to the press that is gathered. They're in the San Francisco area for the APEC summit. This is Asia Pacific gathering. And we've heard tonight that San Francisco has really sort of gone all out to try to show the best of San Francisco to the Chinese president. But there are also very controlled optics around this visit. And now President Biden will come out alone tonight. This is not an opportunity to see him with President Xi, but they did meet earlier today, James, and we are getting some initial readouts on what they talked about and what the takeaways were.
Yeah, we're hearing from senior U.S. officials that sort of the meeting went well, a lot of what we sort of have expected to see. And now we'll hear from the president what happened.
I didn't know this many people in town. Please, have a seat. As you know, I just concluded several hours the meetings with President Xi, and I believe that they were some of the most constructive and productive discussions we've had. I've been meeting with President Xi since both of us were vice president over 10 years ago. Our meetings have always been candid and straightforward. We haven't always agreed, but they've been straightforward. And today, build on the groundwork we laid over the past several months of high-level diplomacy between our teams. We've made some important progress, I believe. First, I'm pleased to announce that after many years of being on hold, we are restarting cooperation between the United States and PRC on counter-narcotics. In 2019, you may remember, China took action to greatly reduce the amount of fentanyl shipped directly from China to the United States. But in the years since that time, the challenge has evolved from finished fentanyl to fentanyl chemical ingredients and pill presses, which are being shipped without control. And by the way, some of these pills are being inserted in other drugs like cocaine. A lot of people are dying. More people in the United States between the ages of 18 and 49 die from fentanyl than from guns, car accidents, or any other cause, period. So today, with this new understanding, we're taking action to significantly reduce the flow of precursor chemicals and pill presses from China to the Western Hemisphere. It's going to save lives, and I appreciate President Xi's commitment on this issue. President Xi and I tasked our teams to maintain a policy and law enforcement coordination going forward to make sure it works. I also want to thank the bipartisan congressional delegation to China, led by Leader Schumer, in October, for supporting this effort so strongly. Secondly, and this is critically important, we're reassuming military-to-military contacts, direct contacts. As a lot of you press know who follow this, that's been cut off, and it's been very worrisome. That's how accidents happen, misunderstandings. So we're back to direct, open, clear, direct communications on a direct basis. Vital miscalculations on either side can cause real trouble with a country like China or any other major country. And so I think we're made real progress there as well. And thirdly, we're going to get our experts together to discuss risk and safety issues associated with artificial intelligence. As many of you who travel with me around the world, almost everywhere I go, every major leader wants to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence. These are tangible steps in the right direction to determine what's useful and what's not useful, what's dangerous and what's acceptable. Moreover, There are evidence of cases that I've made all along. The United States will continue to compete vigorously with the PRC, but will manage that competition responsibly so it doesn't veer into conflict or accidental conflict. And where it's possible, where our interests coincide, we're going to work together like we did on fentanyl. That's what the world expects of us. The rest of the world expects, not just in people in China and the United States, but the rest of the world expects that of us. And that's what the United States is going to be doing. Today, President Xi and I also exchanged views on a range of regional and global issues, including Russia's refusal and brutal war to stop the war and brutal war of aggression against Ukraine and conflict in Gaza. And as I always do, I raised areas where the United States has concerns about the PRC's actions, including detained and exit-banned U.S. citizens, human rights, and coercive activities in the South China Sea. We discussed all three of those things. I gave them names of individuals that we think are being held, and hopefully we can get them released as well. No agreement on that. No agreement on that. I also stressed the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. It's clear that we object to Beijing's non-market economic practices and disadvantage American businesses and workers, and that we'll continue to address them. And I named what I thought a number of those were. I welcome the positive steps we've taken today, and it's important for the world to see that we're implementing the approach in the best traditions of American diplomacy. We're talking to our competitors, and the key, and just talking, just being blunt with one another, so there's no misunderstanding, as a key element to maintaining global stability and delivering for the American people. And in the months ahead, we're going to continue to preserve and pursue high-level diplomacy at the PRC in both directions to keep the lines of communication open, including between President Xi and me. He and I agreed that each one of us could pick up the phone, call directly, and would be heard immediately. And that's, now I'd like to be able to take some questions, if I may. And I'm told that Dimitri of the Financial Times has the first question.
Thank you. And as an Irishman, I apologize for bringing the rain.
Well, holy God, I wouldn't have called on you if I'd known that. No, I'm teasing. Go ahead, fire away, Dimitri.
President Biden, given that America is playing a key role in two major global crises, in Ukraine and in Gaza, does that alter your previous commitment to defend Taiwan from any Chinese military action? And did Xi Jinping outline the conditions under which China would attack Taiwan?
Look, I reiterated what I've said since I've become president, what every previous president of late has said, that we maintain an agreement that there is a one China policy, and that I'm not going to change that. That's not going to change. And so that's about the extent to which we discussed it. Next question, sorry, was Bloomberg.
It appears, among other issues, that your agreement with President Xi over fentanyl will require a lot of trust and verification to ensure success, curbing those drug flows. I'm wondering, after today, and considering all that you've been through in the past year, would you say, Mr. President, that you trust President Xi? And secondly, if I could, on Taiwan, you and your administration officials have warned President Xi and China about interference in the upcoming elections. I'm wondering, what would the consequences be if they do, in fact, interfere in those elections?
Well, I had that discussion with him, too, made it clear I didn't expect any interference, any at all. And we had that discussion as he was leaving. Look, do I trust you? I trust but verify, as that old saying goes. That's where I am. And, we're in a competitive relationship, China and the United States. But my responsibility is to make this rational and manageable, so it doesn't result in conflict. That's what I'm all about. That's what this is about. To find a place where we can come together and where we find mutual interest but most importantly, from my perspective, that are in the interest of the American people. That's what this is about. And that's exactly what we'll do. We're in a situation where we agreed that fentanyl and its precursors will be curbed substantially, and the pill presses. That's a big movement. They're doing, and by the way, I guess I shouldn't identify where it occurred, but John, I know 2 people near where I live. Their kids literally, as that's strange, they woke up dead. Someone had inserted in, whether the young man did or not, inserted in a drug he was taking, fentanyl. Again, I hope you don't have any experience with knowing anyone, but this is the largest killer, people in that age category. And, I guess the other thing I think is most important is that since I spent more time with President Xi than any world leader has, just because we were vice presidents. His president was President Hu. I'm not making a joke. President Hu and President Obama thought we should get to know one another. It wasn't appropriate for the president of the United States to be dealing with the vice president. So we met, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 68 hours of just face-to-face, just us and a simultaneous interpreter. So I think I know the man. I know his modus operandi. He's been, we have disagreements. He has a different view than I have on a lot of things, but he's been straight. I don't mean that it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just been straight. And we, as I said, the thing that I find most assuring is he raised, and I fully agree, that either one of us have any concern, Mr. Ambassador, any concern about anything between our nations or happening in our region, we should pick up the phone and call one another, and we'll take the call. That's an important progress. I'm embarrassed. I think it's CBS, but I can't remember who is CBS. I'm sorry.
Mr. President, good day.
Sorry. I apologize.
You continue to stress the need to ensure competition with China does not veer into conflict or competition. In the past 2 years, there have been 180 incidents of Chinese aggression against U.S. aircraft in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, ramped up military activity in the South China Sea. If that does not count as veering into competition, then what does? And did you issue a warning against that?
Well, first of all, none of it did end up in a conflict, number one. Number two, you may recall I did a few little things like get the Quad together, allow Australia to have access to new submarines, moving in the direction of work with the Philippines. So our actions speak louder than our words. He fully understands.
And because of the news of today, sir, I do have a question about the idea of trade on the Al-Shifa hospital, as it tries to contain and take out the Hamas that is there. This week, you also said that we must protect hospitals. So when you weigh the target against the number of civilians inside the hospital, is the operation underway justified?
Well, look, we did discuss this, by the way, but we can't let it get out of control. Here's the situation. You have a circumstance where the first war crime is being committed by Hamas by having their headquarters, their military, hidden under a hospital. And that's a fact. That's what's happened. Israel did not go in with large number of troops, did not raid, did not rush everything down. They've gone in, and they've gone in with their soldiers carrying weapons, their guns. They were told, let me be precise. We've discussed the need for them to be incredibly careful. You have a circumstance where you know there is a fair number of Hamas terrorists. Hamas has already said publicly that they plan on attacking Israel again, like they did before, do everything cutting babies' heads off to burning women and children alive. And so the idea that they're going to just stop and not do anything is not realistic. This is not the carpet bombing. This is a different thing. They're going through these tunnels. They're going in the hospital. And if you notice, I was mildly preoccupied today. I apologize. I didn't see everything. But what I did see, whether I haven't had it confirmed yet, I am asked my team to answer the question. But what happened is they're also bringing in incubators. We're bringing in other means to help the people in the hospital. And they've given the doctors and, I'm told, the doctors and nurses and the personnel an opportunity to get out of harm's way. So this is a different story than I believe what was occurring before with indiscriminate bombing. What do you got? Washington Post. I think that's right.
Mr. President.
Oh, there you are. Sorry, I couldn't see in the light.
Mr. President, Israel's war in Gaza more than 11,000 Palestinians just over a month and
I'm
created.
sorry, you're breaking up. I didn't.
Israel's war in Gaza has killed more than 11,000 Palestinians just over a month and created a humanitarian disaster. Israeli officials have said this war could take months or even years. Have you communicated to Prime Minister Netanyahu any sort of deadline or time frame for how long you are willing to support Israel in this operation? Are you comfortable with the operation going on indefinitely, and is there any deal underway to free hostages? Thank you.
Yes, no, working backwards, forward. Look, I have been deeply involved in moving on the hostage negotiation. I don't want to get ahead of myself here because I don't know what's happened in the last 4 hours, but we've gotten great cooperation from the Qataris. I've spoken with them as well a number of times. I think the pause and that the Israelis have agreed to, it's down to, well, I'm getting too much detail. I know, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to stop. But I am mildly hopeful. I'm mildly hopeful. With regard to when is this going to stop, I think it's going to stop when Hamas no longer maintains the capacity to murder and abuse and just do horrific things to the Israelis. And they still think that, at least as of this morning, they still thought they could. I guess the best way for me to say it is that I take a look. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, acknowledges they have an obligation to use as much caution as they can in going after their targets. It's not like they're rushing in the hospital, knocking down doors and, pulling people aside and shooting people indiscriminately. But Hamas, as I said they plan on attacking Israelis again. And this is a terrible dilemma. So what do you do? I think that Israel is also taking risks themselves about their folks being killed and one-to-one going through these hospital rooms, hospital halls. But one thing has been established is that Hamas does have headquarters, weapons, materiel below this hospital, and I suspect others. But how long it's going to last, I don't know. Look, I made it clear to the Israelis that to Bibi and to his war cabinet, that I think the only ultimate answer here is a two-state solution that's real. We got to get to the point where there is an ability to be able to even talk without worrying about whether or not we're just dealing with, they're dealing with Hamas that's going to engage in the same activities they did over the past, on the 7th. So but I can't tell, I'm not a fortune teller, I can't tell you how long it's going to last. But I can tell you I don't think it ultimately ends until there's a two-state solution. I made it clear to the Israelis I think it's a big mistake for them to think they're going to occupy Gaza and maintain Gaza. I don't think that works. And so I think you're going to see efforts to bring along, well, I shouldn't go into any more because that's been things I've been negotiating with Arab countries and others about what the next steps are. But anyway, thank you all very much. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. This ends the press conference.
When Hamas said they plan on doing the same thing again, what they did on the 7th. They're going to go in, they want to slaughter Israelis. They want to do it again. They've said it out loud. They're not kidding about it. They're not backing off. And so I just asked a rhetorical question. I wonder what we would do if that were the case.
On the hostages, though, you said we're coming for you. What do you mean to the American hostages when you said, hang tight, we're coming for you?
What I meant was I'm doing everything in my power to get you out. Coming to help you, to get you out. I don't mean sending military in to get them. Is that what you thought I might mean? No. I was not talking about the military. I was talking about you're on our mind every single day, 5, 6 times a day. I'm working on how I can be helpful in getting the hostages released and have a period of time where there's a pause long enough to let that happen. And there are somewhere between 50 and 100 hostages there, we think.
And sir, one's a 3-year-old American child.
You're darn right it is. That's why I'm not going to stop till we get her.
Who can hold the hours? Can you detail for us what kind of evidence the U.S. has seen that Hamas has a command center under Al-Shifa Hospital?
No, I can't tell you. I won't tell you.
Do you feel absolutely confident based on what you know that that is the truth?
Yes.
And Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that is based on a form of government totally different than ours. Anyway, we may stop.
President Biden eventually leaving the room there in Woodside, California, taking some extra questions at the end. Here are some of the big takeaways. He started off by saying that he and Chinese President Xi made progress on curbing fentanyl exports to the United States, and also they've restarted or agreed to restart direct communication between the U.S. and Chinese military. President Biden said the two leaders would keep communication open. Now, the president also took questions on other issues, including Israel's actions in Gaza as they respond to the October 7th attacks by Hamas. I'm joined by James Homan, Rhonda Colvin, and Olivier Knox. James, I want to start in reverse order there and start where President Biden left off. In case our audience couldn't quite hear some of the questions being yelled there at the end, let's go over some of the details that we did learn from the president about what he's saying to Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and also what he believes the U.S. role is at this moment in Israel.
Absolutely. And for those who couldn't quite hear, the last question was, you've said in the past that Xi Jinping is a dictator. Do you still believe that? Biden said yes. But the news there, again, some of the shouted questions, and we'll talk about the broader substance. Peter Alexander from NBC said, are you going to use the U.S. military to go in and get the hostages, 50 to 100 hostages? Biden said, no, I'm not talking about U.S. military. I'm talking about doing everything else in my power. He said Qatar has been really helpful in the other Arab countries. On Israel, he's trying to thread the needle here a little bit. Obviously, expressing support and solidarity with Israel, but saying we can't let it get out of control, saying very definitively in his own words, putting the prestige of the United States on the line, that Hamas's military headquarters is hidden underneath the hospital, crediting Israel for not, as he said, this is not carpet bombing, it's not indiscriminate, for sending in troops to go into this Al-Shifa hospital where the Israelis say Hamas has been operating militarily. And then our colleague Yasmin asked, how long will the U.S. support Israel in this war? Biden said that he's not a fortune teller. He doesn't know how long it's going to last, but I think this is news. He said, "I've told Israel it is a mistake to think that they can occupy Gaza," kind of suggesting where the pressure is going. On the hostages, at that point, he said that he's mildly hopeful, but didn't want to get ahead of the negotiations. And so not a ton new there. Obviously, the administration hopes for movement on these hostages. There was a very large demonstration here in Washington yesterday by supporters of Israel, coming on the heels of a large pro-Palestinian march a few weeks ago. So this is obviously very fraught and delicate. You saw Biden looking at Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and saying, "I'm not going to say any more. I don't want to get over my skis."
Even though he kept talking.
And then he kept talking.
I do want to point out, though, this question about the hospital is so essential and so sensitive. The Washington Post has reporting talking about how this has been an ongoing focus. This hospital in particular has been an ongoing focus of the Israeli military, and they have made this plan to launch this military operation to the hospital for quite a while. And so there's going to be questions and pressure on just what the United States knows about going into the hospital, just what is being found, and really what the extent is and what's being done to protect civilians, which is something that the reporters were getting to in their questions, James.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, the Israelis have been laying the foundation to go this way for a while. And, you know, there was a briefing at the Washington Post with a senior IDF official who was showing satellite images to kind of try to make the case that Hamas did have a presence here. They've been trying to lay the groundwork to do this. I do think that they have sort of backed away from a more aggressive striking campaign from where they were a few weeks ago based on some of the public pressure. But obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty about what is actually going on inside the hospital. There were reports of interrogations. Biden was saying that the Israelis brought ventilators, but he said himself that he couldn't confirm that.
Yeah, and let's remember that the hospital is not just a center for patients now, it's also a place where people are trying to seek refuge as they try to escape the attacks by the Israeli Defense Forces. I want to just go to Rhonda and then get to Olivier to talk to us a little bit bigger picture about how the president discussed tonight the U.S. China relationship and how he sees that relationship evolving, Rhonda.
Yeah, as soon as he came out, he did give the sense that their meeting was, even though it was baby steps, it was successful. It opened up some lines of communication. Some of the things that the White House said that they wanted to bring up and get moving on was that military-to-military communications, which stalled after about August 2022. He said that they have decided to start those communications back up. That's our military communicating with China so that there aren't any, as he said, misunderstandings that could, be fatal or geopolitically destructive. That was his second point. I thought it was interesting that the very first thing he said out of the gate was that he did get some sort of agreement from Xi about stemming the flow of fentanyl precursors. We talked about that earlier. Those are those ingredients to create fentanyl, which we know contributes to the opioid crisis and deaths in the United States. I thought it's always interesting to hear what's said, but also when it's said. That mention of fentanyl was at the top of his comments. So I think that speaks to sort of the balancing act between President Biden and candidate Biden, as we discussed earlier. That issue of the opioid crisis is something that all Americans can understand. I remember when traveling ahead of the midterm elections last fall, I remember talking to Republicans saying that this was a crucial issue for them. It's crucial for Democrats as well. It does not matter your political leanings, but it is something that Americans can understand. So the fact that he said that they have gotten guarantees on stemming the flow of fentanyl precursors, that was major. Of course, the military-to-military communication also was.
Can we stop there, because I want to just play some of that tape from the very beginning of the president's remarks, and then we can respond to it. Let's hear how he started off his news tonight.
I'm pleased to announce that after many years of being on hold, we are restarting cooperation between the United States and PRC on counter-narcotics. In 2019, you may remember, China took action to greatly reduce the amount of fentanyl shipped directly from China to the United States. But in the years since that time, the challenge has evolved from finished fentanyl to fentanyl chemical ingredients and pill presses, which are being shipped without control. And by the way, Some of these pills are being inserted in other drugs like cocaine. A lot of people are dying. More people in the United States between the ages of 18 and 49 die from fentanyl than from guns, car accidents, or any other cause, period. So today, with this new understanding, we're taking action to significantly reduce the flow of precursor chemicals and pill presses from China to the Western Hemisphere. It's going to save lives, and I appreciate President Xi's commitment on this issue.
That's President Biden speaking earlier. He started off his press conference talking about fentanyl and trying to curb how those chemicals leave China and get to the United States and are processed into fentanyl in places before the United States and in the U.S. Olivier, let's talk about whether that's a big accomplishment in terms of two things: what President Biden can present to the American audience, and also, is it much of a concession from President Xi?
Right. So if I could put this in slightly crass political terms, no one's going to put "I restored military-to-military communication" on a campaign bumper sticker, but fentanyl has just incredible salience in the United States, just because of the number of Americans who know someone who has either died from an overdose or has a family member who died from an overdose. It's an enormously important thing. It's an enormously frustrating thing. At the state level, at the local level, at the federal level, Americans have been battling the opioid crisis for years now. So in terms of something that he can turn around and sell to the American public, great. In terms of what actually happens, that's a bit more complicated. You know, the readout I saw from the Chinese side talked about setting up working groups to discuss the fentanyl crisis. Well, that's not quite what the White House is characterizing as significant steps to curb the flow of those precursor chemicals, the flow of the pill presses. So we need a little more detail on exactly what steps were agreed to. And this is where the two presidents not having a joint statement makes it a little harder, because Biden and the White House generally are really leaning into this fentanyl announcement, and it looks like almost an afterthought in the Chinese version of what happened today.
I want to go back to James to get your 1,000-foot view of this meeting, what we know so far about what the two presidents came away with, especially in terms of how President Biden couched it today.
Yeah, I mean, it even mushier than the counter-narcotics cooperation. He kind of checked off some of the other boxes and used words like, "we exchanged views on Ukraine and Gaza." You know, you wouldn't expect there to be some big agreement there. He mentioned human rights. He said that there was not an agreement, but that he gave Xi a list of American citizens who the U.S. government feels are being wrongfully held in China. He complained about the feeling by U.S. businesses that they're facing economic coercion by the Chinese government. And he mentioned Taiwan. I think the Taiwan answer to that first question in the press conference, where he reiterated support for the one China policy, is reflective of a desire to warm up what has been a very cold relationship. Then in the second question, he said, you know, "I trust but verify" with Xi when he was asked whether he trusted him. And then asked by Bloomberg about the consequences of election interference, he didn't outline any consequences, but he said that Biden did raise it while Xi was sort of getting up to leave the meeting, and that it did come up, and he told him China must not interfere in the 2024 election. And then he said, you know, he wants the relationship to be more rational and manageable. On the fentanyl piece, you know, he indicated that this is personal. He referred to the kids of two people he knows in his home state of Delaware who died, didn't wake up, as he put it, after injecting fentanyl. But it was interesting because the frame clearly, you know, I thought one of the most interesting dynamics was how much he was staying on script. He was really reading from those cue cards. He was reading from the teleprompter. That speaks to the diplomatic delicacy of a lot of this. And so the first part of the statement and the first couple questions were very sort of proactive, very positive. And then the third question from CBS put Biden sort of on the defensive about the risk of conflict and increasing incursions between U.S. and Chinese troops. And then Biden, I think, kind of took the opposite tack, which was just that he was responding to the framing of the question and said, "I got the Quad together," which is this effort to check China. "I got Australia their nuclear subs. I've been working with the Philippines." And I think that is much closer to where Biden and his posture actually has been for the last 24 months. compared to the tone at the top, which was sort of like, oh, we're kind of working together, we're going to have this rational and manageable relationship.
Where does this go from here, Rhonda?
Yeah, and to speak to that, it does show you the fraught nature of this meeting, of the relationship. It could crumble in ways that, are quick. So it shows you that every choice of what he said and the tone from the beginning to the end may have been a little different because it's still a relationship that has a lot of fault lines. So it's going to be interesting to see where this goes from here. I think we will probably hear more about China from Biden. I think that's safe to assume. We will hear it integrated into the 2024 messaging from him, also the Republican candidates as well. It's not going to stop with this. But I think at least the White House wanted to give a sense that the meeting at least started to set at least a tone or reset a tone with China. But of course, so many of these issues are so delicate, we just don't know the future.
Olivier, I want to go back to you to have you talk about where President Biden almost ended his press conference today, and that's talking about what's happening in Gaza. There was this raid of a hospital. So far, what the Israelis have shown as the haul, so to speak, from that is pretty minimal. It's a handful of weapons. It's a real question mark as to what they're getting out of this raid. How did the president talk about that and respond to this question about America's commitment to continuing this conflict?
I thought he stuck very much the tone that he's kept since about a week into the crisis triggered by the Hamas massacres of October 7th. He's expressing caution about how Israel proceeds, urging caution from Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he's still lining up the United States pretty much foursquare behind Israel. He declined to set any kind of a limit or a timetable. Words of caution are not the same things as conditioning the shipment of more American weapons on very specific rules of the road. So tonight, at least publicly, it was notable to me that he said, I asked the rhetorical question, if this had been us, how would we be responding? So he's stuck very much to the idea of empathizing with Israel, helping Israel, supporting Israel, and not really, at least in public, not really setting any significant limits on the military operation. He said tonight it would, as James pointed out, he says, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know how long it's going to last, but it's going to last until Hamas has lost the ability to conduct attacks on Israel, which is obviously very important because that is the goal of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
James.
I just think it's so interesting that the press conference ended on that note because Biden came into office thinking his focus was going to be on China, that it's the great strategic competitor of the future. I believe he still thinks that, but his foreign policy and his presidency has been so much defined by helping Ukraine in the largest land war in Europe since World War II, in a very kind of traditional U.S. versus Russia throwback to the Cold War, and now getting pulled into this Israel conflict, and the fact that the press conference ended with these urgent questions about how long is this war going to go, is a reflection of how difficult it has been for the last few presidents to focus on competing with China when the U.S. does have all these other commitments across the globe.
Did we get a fuller picture, James, of how the president sees China in relation to what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Russia right now, in Ukraine, frankly?
I think that the way he kind of referred to it at the beginning, it does seem like Biden is trying to prevent China from sort of winning out of these other conflicts. That sort of China there's been a lot of evidence about China making inroads with some of the Arab states by positioning themselves. China isn't the ally of Israel that the United States is. Similarly, China has kind of tried to take advantage of the U.S. being focused on Europe and the Middle East to make inroads in Africa. And so I think Biden is mindful of that and is trying to look at the whole board, and some stability in the China relationship ultimately does allow the president to then keep his focus on trying to get the hostages released, trying to get Congress to fund support for Ukraine, to build the munitions so that the war can go on and doesn't stay in a stalemate.
So what happens now, James? We see this APEC summit as the backdrop happening in San Francisco. Where does this story go from here?
So they're not, as Michael Birnbaum was telling us, under pressure from Sherrod Brown, domestic political pressure, thinking about 2024. They're not going to announce this big Indo-China free trade agreement, which makes the Chinese happy because the Chinese would have seen it as sort of a countering them, something like TPP was originally intended to do. But ultimately, the U.S. is trying to build these strong bilateral relationships with all these Asian Pacific countries to counter China. China similarly is trying to make inroads with these same countries. And I think both the U.S. and China sort of want a lot of these Asian Pacific countries to choose to pick a side. You're either with the U.S. or you're with China. And these countries don't want to do that because in many cases, China is their largest trading partner, even at the same time that it's the United States that provides essentially their security umbrella. So that is a dynamic that's going to continue to play out in the future presidencies, and in some ways is going to be, I mean, if you really want to think big, the story of the 21st century.
Well, that's the note to end it on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of my guests tonight, including James, Rhonda, Olivier Knox, Michael Birnbaum, and our colleague Yasmin Abutaleb, who's reporting live, and you saw her ask a question there of President Biden. Let's reflect on what we heard tonight. Biden announced that the U.S. and China will work together on curbing those fentanyl ingredients coming to the United States. They'll also restart direct military-to-military contact. And these were the president's first remarks since he met with Xi earlier today. Biden also defended America's support for Israel and would not put limits on that support, even as Israel's military is under scrutiny for entering a hospital in Gaza as Gazans are struggling to survive. Biden also said he's continuing to work on advocating for the rescue and release of hostages held by Hamas. Biden was specific to say not with U.S. military, but in other ways. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this special report from the newsroom of The Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.